Number 18 was so shocking that city relief workers refused to believe families ate it. Number 3 contains an ingredient wellness companies now sell for $18 a jar. Farm families survived where city people starved, and their food is why. We're counting down 25 forgotten meals that kept rural America alive during the Great Depression, ranked from the simplest everyday staples to the single survival practice that held entire communities together. Starting at number 25, a breakfast that cost less than half a penny to make. Number 25, cornmeal mush was the meal that waited on the stove before sunrise. A quarter-pound of cornmeal stirred into 4 cups of water could feed a family for less than half a penny per serving, 0.44 cents, according to a 1932 North Dakota co-op ledger. In Appalachian kitchens, it was called Johnny Cake Mush, and it showed up on the table 5 mornings a week, fueling children and adults for chores that began before daylight. When there were leftovers, the slices were chilled overnight, then fried crisp in lard for the next day's breakfast. There was no waste, just a ritual of thrift, warmth, and the quiet labor of mothers who turned pennies into sustenance, morning after morning. Number 24, dandelion green salad, arrived with the first warmth of April, when farmyards turned from mud to a patchwork of wild green. Before the yellow blooms appeared, women and children gathered the young leaves by hand, a free harvest. No cash was needed, just time and sharp eyes. In southern kitchens, this became the famous wilted salad, tossed with a splash of hot bacon fat and vinegar, the scent rising sharp and savory. Folk wisdom claimed a bowl of these greens packed more vitamin A than a whole pound of carrots. Modern science now confirms that claim. For a few short weeks, this foraged salad delivered a burst of color and vital nutrition, marking the end of winter's starch monotony. It was a meal that cost nothing but the knowledge of where to look and the memory of when to gather. Number 23. Pinto bean soup was the backbone of countless farm suppers, poured steaming from battered pots into chipped bowls. A 25-pound sack of pinto beans, often bought for just 89 cents at the co-op in 1933, could stretch across 3 weeks of meals for a family of 6. Diaries from Tennessee recall 30 straight days of beans, a monotony softened only by a scrap of ham bone or a pinch of onion when either could be spared. Beans were soaked overnight, a small act that saved precious stove fuel and made the pot last longer. This was protein by the ladle, a meal that fed children and adults alike, quietly transforming thrift into survival. In these kitchens, beans were not just food, they were security, the poor man's meat, and a lesson in how knowledge, not money, kept hunger from the door. Number 22. Salt pork and cabbage brought winter flavor to the farmhouse table when fresh meat was long gone. In November, after the butchering was done and the hams hung in the smokehouse rafters, what remained of the hog was packed in salt, fatback, jowl, and belly, preserved for the lean months ahead. Salt pork kept without refrigeration. It was a miracle of thrift and chemistry. Thin slices, cut from the slab, were fried crisp in a cast-iron skillet, their rendered fat poured over a pot of boiling cabbage or potatoes. This was more than seasoning. It was a way to stretch every ounce of meat, to make a little go a long way. Parish butchering records and extension bulletins from the 1930s show how salt-cured pork became a staple, turning cabbage from the root cellar into a meal that warmed the bones and kept families going until spring. It was not abundance, but it was enough. Number 21st, hominy or grits with buttermilk brought a quiet richness to the farm table, especially in the South and the Ohio River Valley. Here, dried corn was soaked in lye, or lime, a practice called nixtamalization, which unlocked nutrients that plain cornmeal could not provide. This simple kitchen science, passed down by farm women, meant a bowl of hominy offered not just calories, but protection against pellagra, the wasting disease of poverty. Served hot with a splash of tangy buttermilk, it became more than a porridge. It was a small act of care, stretching dairy and grain into something sustaining. In county cookbooks and old farm notebooks, hominy and buttermilk appear again and again, a meal that cost pennies yet quietly delivered what modern nutritionists now call a complete protein. Where city diets faltered, this humble dish kept rural families strong, proof that knowledge in the kitchen could mean the difference between survival and sickness. Number 20. Pickled vegetables and chow chow filled pantry shelves with the colors of summer long after the first frost. In the heat of July, farm women stood over steaming kettles, packing cucumbers, green beans, and cabbage into mason jars, pouring in vinegar brine that could hold off spoilage for a full year. The work was relentless. Extension canning logs from the 1930s show families putting up dozens, sometimes hundreds, of jars each season. These preserves were more than condiments. They were insurance against the gray monotony of winter, bringing a flash of garden flavor to every meal. Chow chow, a tangy relish made from whatever was left in the garden row, became a staple on cold plates and with root vegetables. In a world before supermarkets, the mason jar was its own currency, and the root cellar its bank. Every sealed lid was a quiet victory, earned through sweat and shared knowledge, carrying vitamins and color through the darkest months. Number 19. Lard-fried potatoes brought warmth and energy to the farmhouse table when the days were long and the work relentless. Potatoes, stashed in root cellars every autumn, would last 6 or even 8 months, enough to carry a family through the hardest winter. Sliced thick and dropped into a skillet of bubbling lard, they turned golden and crisp, each bite delivering a dense punch of calories. Rendered pork fat, saved from butchering season, was never wasted. It powered the bodies that worked the fields, fueled by the simple logic of fat and starch. With every panful, farm women stretched their stores and their knowledge, turning what others might discard into the backbone of a meal. There was no luxury here, just the hearty satisfaction of food that could keep a man on his feet until sundown. Number 18. Corn pone, or hoe cakes, traveled straight from the skillet to the fields, tucked into pockets or wrapped in a scrap of cloth. Made from nothing but cornmeal and water, sometimes a pinch of salt, the batter was slapped onto a hot cast-iron pan, or, if you were truly in a hurry, the flat of a cleaned hoe over open coals. The result was a sturdy golden flat cake, crisp at the edges and soft inside, eaten plain or with a smear of drippings. There was disbelief among city relief workers who saw farm children carry these simple cakes for lunch, unable to fathom how such plain food could fuel a day's labor. Yet for those who made them, corn pone was proof that survival didn't require money or markets, just a skillet, a handful of meal, and the knowledge passed down through kitchen pamphlets and battered recipe cards. In these small, portable meals, the logic of farm life was baked right in. Food that could travel, food that could last, food that needed no apology. Number 17. Milk gruel or barley porridge was the quiet morning anchor in countless farmhouses, especially for the youngest at the table. In the Midwest, mothers measured out a modest scoop of barley or oats, simmering it gently in water until the grains softened and thickened. Into this pot went a careful pour of fresh milk, never more than the cows could spare, but just enough to turn the porridge creamy and rich. As the grains released their starch, the milk would scald and thicken, stretching a small ration to feed many. Extension menus from the 1930s show this meal appearing before sunrise. Served hot in chipped bowls to children headed for chores. It was humble, yes, but offered more nourishment than plain mush, protein, calcium, and warmth, all coaxed from the intersection of grain, milk, and the steady hands of women who knew how to make a little last. In these kitchens, breakfast was not just a meal, It was a quiet act of care, repeated day after day, ensuring that even the smallest children started their work with something more than hope in their bellies. Number 16. Bread and drippings was the meal that proved nothing in the farmhouse went to waste. Not even the fat left in the skillet after frying. Every kitchen kept a crock or tin on the stove, collecting the precious drippings from bacon, salt pork, or roast. When butter ran out, it was this cooled, savory fat that got spread on thick slices of stale bread, sometimes with a sprinkle of salt, sometimes eaten just as it was. Parish records and women's recipe notebooks describe how a heel of bread and a smear of drippings could stand in for a snack, a lunch, or even a supper when times were leanest. There was no shame in it. Only the quiet ingenuity of stretching every calorie, turning yesterday's leftovers into today's sustenance. In these small, thrifty acts, farm women kept hunger at bay, proving that survival depended less on what you had and more on what you knew to do with it. Number 15. Pot liquor and greens was more than a side dish. It was a ritual of thrift and nourishment, born from simmering collards or turnip greens with a ham hock until the leaves surrendered their minerals to the broth. When the greens were lifted from the pot, what remained was pot liquor, a savory, vitamin-rich liquid, deep green and flecked with bits of pork, prized as much as the vegetables themselves. In Appalachian kitchens, the custom was to dip cornbread into this broth, soaking up every drop of flavor and nutrition. Oral histories recall children waiting for the pot liquor at the end of the meal, knowing it held the strength of the garden and the smokehouse together in one bowl. Long before science named the value of phytonutrients, farm women knew this broth was medicine, prescribed not by doctors, but by grandmothers who understood that nothing, not even the water from boiled greens, should ever go to waste. Number 14. Root cellar beet hash was the heart of winter in farm kitchens, where fresh produce had long vanished from the fields. In Nebraska and across the prairie states, the root cellar was more than storage. It was a lifeline, layered with beets, carrots, and potatoes, stacked in careful rotation against the cold. When the snow drifted high and the wind rattled the windows, mothers diced these vegetables and fried them slowly in lard saved from autumn butchering, then stewed the mixture until the flavors melded into a deep, earthy hash. Extension bulletins from the 1930s describe cellar inventories down to the last pound, a silent record of how families survived between harvests. Protein was scarce, so every calorie counted. Beet hash was not a luxury, but it was reliable. Each bowl was proof that knowledge of storage in season, not cash, kept hunger at bay until spring returned. Number 13. Dried fruit cakes and applesauce pudding brought a rare sweetness to the farmhouse table, especially when winter felt endless. Slices of sun-dried apples or pears, strung on kitchen twine and stored in crocks, were soaked back to life in simple batters, no extra sugar needed, just the memory of last summer's orchard. In family cookbooks and church festival menus, applesauce pudding appears as a Sunday treat, thick and spiced with cinnamon, sometimes poured into a worn baking tin and left to steam on the back of the stove. These desserts were more than calories. They were morale boosters, a promise that even in lean times, there was room for celebration. When sugar was scarce, dried fruit and applesauce stretched every pinch, turning preservation into comfort and reminding families that joy could be made from what was already on hand. Number 12. Milk soup with dumplings was the meal that turned a scant quart of fresh milk into a supper that filled 4 hungry children. In the hands of a farm mother, milk was scalded gently over the wood stove, then thickened with quick pinches of flour dough, just 3 tablespoons, rolled and dropped in by the spoonful. The dumplings swelled and softened, stretching the pot as far as it would go. Iowa State's 1936 home economics curriculum recorded this dish as a staple for lean evenings, a step up from the simpler milk gruel of earlier mornings. Here, a little more skill and planning made the difference. A richer, heartier bowl, warm with dairy, and the promise that nothing would be wasted. In homes where every drop of milk mattered, this soup was a lesson in making plenty from almost nothing, a quiet act of care and calculation, repeated without fanfare, night after night. Number 11. Field pan fried fish brought the taste of wild water straight to the farmhouse table. In spring and summer, boys and fathers waded into creeks or fished the edges of farm ponds, pulling up bluegill or perch with a cane pole and a bit of string. What they caught in the morning would be cleaned, dredged in cornmeal, and hit a hot skillet by noon, crisp, golden, and sizzling with the scent of fresh-caught protein. For families far from the coast, this was a rare feast, free nourishment from the land itself, not the store. When the catch was plentiful, surplus fish were salted down for leaner months, but nothing matched the flavor of fish eaten the same day, pan-fried in lard beside the garden. In a world where meat was often preserved or stretched thin, a plate of fresh fish was a brief, bright celebration of season and skill, a meal that reminded farm families how much the landscape could give if you knew where and when to look. Number 10. Bean and corn. Succotash was a quiet marvel of farm science, long before anyone spoke of amino acids or complete proteins. In summer, fresh green beans and sweet corn came straight from the garden, simmered together in a heavy iron pot with a pinch of salt and maybe a scrap of pork if luck allowed. When winter set in, dried beans took the place of fresh, their sturdy flavor softened by the sweetness of last season's corn, cut from the cob and dried on the porch rafters. Every spoonful joined legume and grain, creating a protein synergy that modern nutritionists would later praise. For farm women, it was simply what worked. Diaries and heritage cookbooks record how this pairing turned what seemed like side dishes into a meal that could carry a family through a day's labor. In a world without labels or diet plans, knowledge passed from mother to daughter made the farm kitchen a place where thrift and nourishment walked hand in hand. Number 9. Skillet fried egg and greens was the quiet triumph of backyard animal husbandry. A single egg gathered warm from the coop, cracked into a battered skillet with whatever greens the garden or field could spare. Tenant diaries from the 1930s tell how one egg, scrambled with a handful of turnip tops or wild dock, could stretch to feed 2 children before chores. In many farm communities, eggs became a kind of informal currency, traded 1 for 1 with neighbors for a cup of milk, or saved for a Sunday breakfast when meat was scarce. WPA interviews recall how women managed small flocks, not just for their own tables, but to keep these quiet exchanges alive. The skillet fried egg and greens meal was more than protein. It was a daily act of resilience, a testament to micro-livestock and the invisible economy of bartered food, a reminder that, on the farm, survival was built on knowledge, not just crops or coin. 8th place, barbecue leftover stew was the meal that proved nothing from the smokehouse ever truly went to waste. When the last ham was sliced and the sausage links were gone, what remained were scraps, smoked bones, trimmed fat, and bits too tough or small for the table. Farm women gathered these remnants, dropping them into a large kettle with beans, onions, and whatever garden vegetables survived the week. The pot simmered all day, drawing out the deep, layered flavor of hickory and pork, transforming scraps into a stew hearty enough to feed a crowd. Diaries from the 1930s recall these gatherings, where neighbors brought their own trimmings to the communal pot, sharing both food and stories. In a world where every calorie mattered, barbecue stew was not just a meal, but a lesson in resourcefulness, a savory reminder that survival depended less on what you had and more on what you could make from almost nothing. Number 7. Hoe cake with molasses was the sweet reward that waited at the end of a long day, when the fields were quiet and the kitchen still smelled of wood smoke. A hot hoe cake, just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, came off the skillet steaming, its crisp edges ready to catch every drop of blackstrap molasses drizzled on top. For children, this was more than a treat. It was a taste of celebration, a rare moment when thrift gave way to something almost luxurious. Blackstrap molasses, thick and dark, was rich in iron and minerals, and a single tablespoon delivered more iron than some modern supplements. Price lists from the 1930s show molasses as a precious pantry staple, rationed carefully, but always kept for days when spirits needed lifting. In those kitchens, a little sweetness was not wasted on birthdays alone. It was a way to remind everyone at the table that survival meant feeding hope as well as hunger. Number 6, church potluck stew and community cornbread brought neighbors together in ways that went far beyond food. Parish minutes and women's club records from the 1930s describe how, when the harvest was in or a family faced hardship, the church hall became a safety net. Stew cauldrons bubbled on wood stoves, built from whatever surplus the gardens and pantries could spare. Root vegetables, beans, and a handful of meat if someone had it. Cornbread was baked in deep pans, cut into thick squares to feed dozens. At these gatherings, widows and the sick received the first ladles, a quiet rule of mutual insurance that everyone honored. In a time when cash was scarce, this was a different kind of economy, one measured in shared labor, open doors, and the promise that no one would go hungry while the community still had something left to give. These meals weren't just about sustenance. They were the living proof that resilience was a group effort, built from the ground up, one bowl at a time. Number 5, homemade sourdough pancakes carried the quiet legacy of a living kitchen. The starter, kept warm on the back of the wood stove and fed daily with flour and water, was more than just a leavening agent. It was a microbial heirloom, handed down from mother to daughter, sometimes transferred in a small crock with a whispered blessing that the bread would always rise. Each batch began the night before, with equal parts starter and flour left to ferment until morning, when the batter bubbled with life. Poured onto a cast iron skillet, these pancakes rose without store-bought yeast or baking powder, saving precious fuel and stretching scant supplies. A 1935 USDA bulletin described the ritual of keeping the starter alive as both necessity and pride. In a world with little cash, the true wealth was a jar of living culture, tended with care, nourishing bodies and binding generations together. Number 4, skillet cornbread was the anchor of the Depression-era farmhouse table. It was more than bread, a tool as much as a meal. In farm kitchens, a well-seasoned 10-inch cast iron skillet was as prized as the bread itself. Cornmeal, salt, a splash of buttermilk if the cow was generous, and a bare spoonful of lard went into the batter. 15 minutes in a hot oven turned it golden and crisp at the edges, ready to be sliced into wedges. These slices did double duty. They were dipped into pot liquor, sopped up milk soup, or crumbled into a bowl to catch the last trace of broth. Some families favored the buttermilk version, its tang cutting through the richness of stews. County cookbooks from Nebraska to Tennessee record dozens of variations, but the logic was always the same. Cornbread made the meal go further, carried calories where spoons could not, and turned a humble pot of liquid into something that filled the belly and the spirit. Coming to the top 3, bone broth soup was the quiet medicine simmering at the back of the farmhouse stove. In kitchens where nothing was wasted, chicken backs, just 2 cents a pound, on the 1934 USDA price list, became the foundation for a stock that could stretch through the week. Bones, gristle, and scraps were covered with water, then left to simmer for 12, sometimes 24 hours, until the liquid turned rich and golden, trembling with gelatin when cold. Farm women called this poor man's stock, but its reputation was anything but poor. Diaries from the Farm Security Administration tell of mothers serving bone broth to the sick, to women recovering after childbirth, and to children who needed strength for the fields. Long before wellness companies bottled the trend and charged $18 a jar, these families understood that nourishment came not from money, but from patience, thrift, and the wisdom of slow food. In a world without supplements or nutritionists, bone broth was both food and remedy, an act of care that turned scraps into sustenance and survival into a kind of quiet science. In second place, sourdough biscuits and gravy carried the weight of generations in every bite. The starter, a living culture fed and kept alive on the back of the stove, was more than just leavening. It was a family heirloom handed from mother to daughter with a whispered hope, "May your bread always rise." One farm wife recalled, "My mother kept the starter on the wood stove. She called it the living loaf and never let it die." In hard times, this tradition meant a kitchen could turn flour and water into biscuits that cost just 3 cents each, as listed in the Sears 1934 catalog. The biscuits came hot from the oven, split and drenched in a milk gravy made from the last spoonful of pork drippings and a scant handful of flour, enough to stretch a sliver of meat into a meal for 6. County Extension bulletins taught women to thicken the gravy with what little fat remained, coaxing flavor and sustenance from almost nothing. This was more than comfort food. It was a ceremony of thrift, fermentation, and fat economy, binding families together and marking the quiet genius of women who turned scarcity into abundance. In these kitchens, survival was handed down, one bubbling crock at a time, setting the stage for the final, ultimate act of rural resourcefulness. One-pot vegetable soup with cornbread was the backbone of Depression-era farm survival, a daily ritual that blurred the line between meal and memory. In Nebraska, cellar logs from the 1930s show careful counts of potatoes, beets, and onions, each destined for the battered pot that never emptied, only renewed. Root vegetables, scraps of carrot and potato, home-canned tomatoes, bitter greens, and a bone from the broth jar simmered together, changing with the season and whatever the land could spare. This was not a recipe. It was a practice. The soup absorbed the rhythm of the farm, stretching sustenance through thrift and invention. Cornbread, baked in a heavy skillet, served as both food and utensil, broken and dipped to soak up every drop. Farm Security Administration photographs captured women at the stove, sleeves rolled, stirring the pot that fed everyone, mothers, children, neighbors, each adding their labor and what little they could share. The meal was shaped by necessity, not luxury, and its flavor came from the knowledge passed down in battered notebooks and spoken memory. Wellness trends now chase bone broth and garden greens, but these kitchens relied on the wisdom of grandmothers, not nutritionists. The lesson was in the discipline of making do, the ritual of renewal, and the refusal to let the pot run dry. Ask your grandparents what kept their table full when money was gone, but hope remained. In those answers lives a kind of resilience still waiting to be honored. Across all 25 meals, one truth endures. Survival was built on kitchen wisdom, not wealth. Farm women were not victims. They were the reason families endured. There were no nutritionists, only grandmothers. The real economy was reciprocity, not cash. These meals fed more than bodies. They preserved hope. What family wisdom still lives in your kitchen? Share your stories below, and let's keep their legacy alive.